All right, welcome back to Western Civ. We've got Napoleon on the ropes here. This is Napoleon in 1813. If you recall, 1812 was the year he invaded Russia. Not a good decision. And advancing all the way to Moscow, a bad decision. And then his retreat out of Russia was a disaster. So we're picking up here in 1813. We've gone to the winter of 1812 and now into the spring of 1813. This will be the demise of Napoleon. He's not going to be able to survive this the disaster in Russia. What's happened is, as he's retreating out of Russia, is a sixth coalition is forming. The first coalition goes back to the French Revolutionary Wars, and then this is the sixth coalition that has fought either against the French Revolution or against Napoleon. This is the sixth coalition. Well, who's in it? Well, the Tsar of Russia. Obviously, Napoleon's been waging war against the Tsar, and so he is leading this sixth coalition against Napoleon. The British are always there. They're always funding these coalitions. They provide the financial support. They can't really supply the armies. They've put their army into Spain and Portugal, that ulcer, Spanish ulcer of Napoleon, but they mainly are the financial backing of all this. So all the coalitions are backed by the French, by the British. In this case, their foreign minister is a man named Castlereagh. He'll be designing this sixth coalition to bring down Napoleon. And so we add to this, as Napoleon is retreating back out of Russia, the first army of Napoleon's that actually turns against him is the Prussians. There had been a Prussian contingent going into Russia, and they actually will switch sides. And now Prussia joins the sixth coalition. The King of Prussia, Frederick William III, not a great king, but his army's pretty valuable. And then the Swedes, Napoleon's own one of his former marshals, Marshal Bernadotte, has turned against Napoleon. So this was quite the disaster there in the Swedes, former Marshal Bernadotte. And then the question comes up of, what about Austria? What about the Austrians? The Austrians have been beaten by Napoleon over and over again. Their emperor is Francis I. He is the one who has sent his daughter to be married to Napoleon. And so he's kind of sitting on the bench, kind of waiting to see which way this is going to go. And he is led by his foreign minister, a man named Metternich. We'll be speaking more about Metternich. Will be the great brains of Austria for the next 50 years, or 40 years. What about the German states? As Napoleon is retreating out of Russia, the German states had been backing him. And so the question comes up of how loyal will these German states be to Napoleon in time of disaster. Napoleon may be only as good as his last victory, and this is a defeat, the disaster in Russia. So looking at the map here in 1813, what we see is here's France, and they've added huge parts of Europe to them. Here's the Austrian Empire, what's left of it anyway, and here's Russia. Here's Napoleon retreating out of Russia, back through Prussia. Prussia switches sides, and then the question is, what about these other German states? Well, these other German states start to switch sides, and the big one, of course, is Austria. What will the Austrians do? So as we enter into the spring of 1813, the French are still retreating into the German states. The Russians are advancing out of Russia now into the Duchy of Warsaw. The poor Poles are caught in the midst of this. Napoleon had reset them on the map, and now they're going to be ruled over by the Russians. And as the French retreat, this frees up again. The Kingdom of Prussia is now out of French control, and they will join the Sixth Coalition. Napoleon finally, in the spring of 1813, turns and is able to fight. He gathers up his resources. As he went into Russia, it was a disaster. And now as he pulls back out, he's able to garner some resources from the German states, or out of Italy or out of Spain. So he actually turns and fights and wins at a couple of battles here in the spring of 1813. Napoleon actually wins the Battle of Lutzen, the Battle of Bautzen. These are technically French victories. He knocks the Prussians and Russians back to the east. But they're not decisive victories. There's something wrong with Napoleon's army. And the problem is, what's wrong with his Grande Armée is that when he went into Russia, his cavalry got decimated. Going into Russia in the summer of 1812, horses were dying everywhere in the hot summer, and then the cold winter coming out they pretty much ate all the horses, and so he's not able to finish these victories. These are victories. His infantry is powerful, and he's a great commander, and he's able to knock the Russians and Prussians back, but he can't finish them off. Cavalry is needed to finish off the enemy, to ride them down as they retreat, and he can't do it. And he calls upon help from Austria. He needs help from his allies. You know, he's married this Austrian empress, and so he needs to maybe get some help from Austria here. Austria sits, you know, in the middle here, under the foreign minister Metternich. And Metternich's quite a shrewd guy here. He's going to play both sides while building his armies. The Austrians, you know, have been beaten over and over again, and now they start to build armies. And which side are they going to go on? Well, as Napoleon wins his two great victories, Lutzen and Bautzen, he then asks for a 2 months of armistice, and this will be a disaster. Many historians point to this and say this was a real mistake here, to ask for a 2-month break, because it kind of exposed his weakness, that he really can't finish off anybody. And it's during those 2 months that the Austrians under Metternich join the Sixth Coalition with Russia, Prussia, Britain, Sweden. But Austria, holding the balance here, has some conditions. They're not just going to turn themselves over to the Tsar of Russia, you know. They have some conditions before they join the Sixth Coalition. They demand to lead. The Austrians are going to lead the Sixth Coalition. They are going to establish one of their men as the commander-in-chief of the Allied armies. It'll be a man named Karl zu Schwarzenberg. And you don't need to memorize this. I'm not going to ask you a test question about it. But I just want you to know that this guy is the guy I studied when I was doing my PhD dissertation. I wrote a biography of Karl Schwarzenberg, the Allied commander-in-chief. Here he is on horseback, leading the Allied coalition. He's best compared to Eisenhower. Not a great commander on the field, but the kind of guy that can hold a coalition together. And he went through a lot of pain working with Metternich to hold this coalition together, having to work with the Russians and the Prussians and the British and the Swedes to try to bring Napoleon down. And he will eventually become a field marshal and the victor, the defeater of Napoleon, actually. So as we go into the fall of 1813, the Sixth Coalition's much stronger now. Napoleon is very angry that the Austrians have turned on him. And this will be the German War of Liberation. If you get a chance to go to Germany, you'll see monuments all over Germany to 1813, the German War of Liberation, the Befreiungskrieg of 1813. The battles break out immediately. You know, Napoleon's quite angry that he called for that 2-month armistice, and then he's ready to go now. There's a big battle at Dresden, massive battle at Dresden. It ends in kind of a stalemate. Some other battles around Berlin. Napoleon's army is on the run. It's kind of running back and forth, trying to fight all these enemies. And as he's doing this, the German states begin to break away. The Germans begin to read the handwriting on the wall that, you know, everyone's turning against Napoleon, and Napoleon doesn't have the army that he used to have. So pretty much by the end of this, only one German state will stand by him, the German state of Saxony. It's a powerful state, but it's the only one that will stay with Napoleon to the bitter end. As Napoleon retreats out of the German states, he will turn and fight. There's a final battle in the German states, the Battle of Leipzig, in October of 1813. As you see here, it is a 3-day battle, the 16th, the 18th, and the 19th. It is a massive battle. It's called the Battle of Nations. The French, with their Grande Armée, or what's left of it, and then all these Allied contingents surrounding Napoleon. And just in a set-piece battle, all these armies converge on him, and they eventually drive him out of Leipzig and destroy what's left of his army, pretty much. The Grande Armée is wiped out after this. As we go into 1814, the Allied armies move into France. This is going to end pretty quickly here. Napoleon doesn't have much left. With what he does have left, he calls up, young recruits and men out of garrisons in France, and he's able to fight a few great battles, racing here and there. It almost seems like Napoleon of old in 1796, the young Napoleon dashing across from battlefield to battlefield. But he just doesn't have the troops, and he doesn't have the cavalry to finish anyone off. So it's kind of interesting to watch a few of his great battles. He's got some great moments. He's still got some fight left in him. But by March, the Allies are able to surround him and actually capture Paris. Napoleon offers an abdication, and he offers to abdicate, and I wrote here this is his first abdication because there will be one coming up. Spoiler alert, there'll be another one. He tries to abdicate to his son. He He had married an Austrian archduchess. He has legitimacy, right? The son is legitimate, right? From a great family. And the Allies will debate on this, what to do with France now that Napoleon's abdicated, and what the decision that they make after going through various candidates, what should we do? They finally talk to some French, mainly a man named Talleyrand, who convinces them that the French want the Bourbons back. That's a bit of a stretch, but anyway, the Allies are convinced that maybe we should just bring back one of the old Bourbons, and it will be Louis XVI's brother, one of his younger brothers. This will be Louis XVIII now. We skip from 16 to 18 in honor of Louis XVI's son who died in prison. So we skip now from 16 to 18. Louis XVIII is back. The Count of Provence will be the King of France, sometimes referred to as Louis the Fat. He has grown quite obese, living off of foreign people giving him things, ever since he left France in 1789. So he will be quite immense and a kind of a weak king. Not a terrible guy, but just very weak. Napoleon, what the Allies decide to do with him is to exile him to the island of Elba. Elba is off the Italian coast, kind of in between Corsica and Italy, so it's near his homeland. It's, in the Italian islands there, the island of Elba, and he will be named the emperor. He will maintain his title as emperor of a little tiny island, and he's supposed to receive $2 million a year. That's quite a bit of money, enough to live on and live in prestige. They don't really deliver the money, and Napoleon doesn't take him long to get tired of this little island. But kind of depressive. If you're a Napoleon fan like I am, this is a sad time for Napoleon. And you'd have to point to ego here. He has pushed his ego to the max. He is suffering from egomania, the invasion of Russia, the failure to make peace in 1813 or 1814. He almost seems like he deserved it. He pushed too far. Well, the Allies, now that Napoleon's been sent away to Elba, the Allies will hold a Congress at Vienna. This is the famous Congress of Vienna. This is one of the great topics of history. The Congress of Vienna, all the European monarchs meeting there after 20 years, from 1789, 20 plus years of French Revolution. What do they want to do? And there will be four great powers there, the British, the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians, to sit down and figure out what to do with Europe. And they are going to try to redraw it, try to sometimes put the genie back in the bottle. Can we turn it back to 1789? We need to redraw the map. Some of it can't be changed. What they are going to base their decisions on is, as they claim, legitimacy. Some rulers are legitimate. Other rulers need to be punished. Some of the rulers have been placed by Napoleon. They'll have to go. So some people are legitimate, some aren't. The victors, obviously themselves, deserve some compensation. And they'll start setting up also some new states. They're called buffer states. The idea that, France was a danger under Napoleon, but that another man like Napoleon could rise up. And so they'll try to build some buffer states against France, try to surround France with some smaller states to try to be a buffer, maybe try to contain France. So here's your map in 1815 as we finish up 1814 into 1815. Here's your map, and you kind of see what the mess here in Central Europe is, as the old states have Napoleon removed them and put in his own states, and so what are you going to do? How do you redraw the map of Europe? You can't go back to 1789 like they'd like to. So another thing that comes up here is, just this ultra-conservatism. They've got to stop any sort of revolution. Revolution is deemed bad. We saw how the French Revolution turned out. It turned out with chopping of heads. It turned out with a military man like Napoleon taking over Europe. So they got to stop revolution in its tracks. That's one thing they agree on all over Europe. So they meet in November of 1814 in Vienna, and it's famous for its dances. There's, Vienna's the city of music and dancing, so there's always nightly dances and music playing everywhere. And meanwhile, the diplomats try to get some work done. I like to point to this to show you, if you're trying to pick a winner in all this, it's got to be Austria. Austria comes out of this with Metternich, and leading the Allied coalition as very potentially the powerful state of Europe. And they'll kind of drop the ball here because they really won't assert themselves the way they should. So the Congress of Vienna, famous for its nightly dances and lots of people leaving together and all kinds of rumors and stuff going on. So that's a lot of fun, to read about how the European diplomats behaved, and all the monarchs are there, the Tsar is there, the King of Prussia is there, the Austrian Emperor is there, all the diplomats and all the kings misbehaving. In fact, here's some cartoons showing not just the dancing, but what are these people doing, these monarchs just dancing around. If you want to try to see some of these people there's the Foreign Minister of England, Castlereagh. Here's the Emperor of Austria, the Tsar of Russia, the King of Prussia. This appears to be a French revolutionary, appears to be hopping mad. And this is the King of Saxony, which we'll talk about in a second, because Saxony is going to be punished in all this. So as we go into 1815, these allies in 1814 were very tightly held together, but by 1815, with Napoleon gone, they begin to sort of move possibly toward war with each other. There's people getting their armies together to break up this allied coalition. The problem is that Russia is really powerful now. You know, they have beaten Napoleon, they say. And as they've moved into Europe, they marched all the way to Paris. As they moved into Europe, they took over Poland, the Duchy of Warsaw, and they're not going to give it back. And Prussia rose up against Napoleon, and they have occupied Saxony, and they don't want to give it back. In fact, if you look at this, Russia and Prussia acting together, they could dominate Europe. They could own Europe, break these states apart. And are you going to let this happen? And so the other states begin to form an alliance against Russia and Prussia. And you'll have the Austrians under Metternich, the British under Castlereagh, and the French, well, under Louis XVIII, but he's not the one pushing this. Talleyrand will be the one asserting that, hey, let us back in, let France back in, give us a role here. You know, don't make us the pariah nation. We can actually help you fight the Russians again. So actually the French will assert themselves under Talleyrand as maybe you might need to fight the Russians again. The war, some historians question how close they came to war, but it might have been. They eventually will settle this. And the way they settle this at the Congress of Vienna is that Russia will keep Poland, but not completely. They'll call it Congress Poland under the rule of the Tsar, or under the guidance of the Tsar. It'll be occupied by Russian armies, of course. And then Prussia will gain just a part of Saxony and some other little states near the Rhine. This is the start of Prussia moving toward the Rhine. So they occupy a large part of Saxony, the last German state to be with Napoleon. And just as this is done, it is announced that Napoleon has escaped from Elba. Some secret agents have got him off the island or got a ship to him, and he has escaped from Elba. And he's landed back in France, and he's marching to Paris with a small group of soldiers, about 1,000 men. He's marching to Paris. And Louis XVIII ran. That's not a good sign for a king to run away from your capital city in the face of just 1,000 French soldiers. What's happened to Napoleon is that all the veterans of France now, they've been humiliated in 1813, 1814, and then when Napoleon has escaped, they rally to him. All the old veterans, they form a new Grande Armée. It's actually quite formidable. I mean, these aren't young recruits. These are old veterans. You know, veterans fight better. And I'll go ahead and tell you, this is going to last about 100 days. This is the famous 100 days of Napoleon, which we'll figure out in a second why it's 100 days. Napoleon's army, he comes to Paris, gathers this army together, and then he immediately goes to war. He's going to march toward Belgium. He is aiming for the British. The British have their army stationed up in Belgium, and it's under the leadership of the Duke of Wellington. Napoleon hasn't fought the British before. He had been down in Spain, and he had chased a British army at one point, but he'd never really fought the British, and, you know, they were claiming to be the great victors here. Well, Napoleon's going to try to take them on. He's going to march straight at the Duke of Wellington. By the way, there's a great movie, if you'd like to watch, a movie called Waterloo, filmed back in the 70s, and it starts right about here with Napoleon capturing Paris and then marching immediately toward Wellington. Really great movie, if you'd like to see a really good movie about Napoleon. So here's Napoleon's army gathering up, marching straight toward Belgium, aiming for the Duke of Wellington, who claimed to have, saved Spain, conquered Spain. So here it is. Here's Napoleon in 1815, reclaiming his glory. Seems to have trimmed up a little bit here. All the veterans rallying back to him. Several of his old marshals coming back to him, several of them not coming back to him, but several come back to him. And he marches toward Belgium, and he'll be meeting the British at a place called Waterloo. And if you're British, this is your great victory against Napoleon, but historians today, we call it the Great Irrelevance. It's not really relevant at all. There's no way Napoleon can win. Even if he defeated the British army, other armies are converging. The Austrian army, the Russian army, the Prussian army, they're all converging on him. He can't win. He's been outlawed. The Congress, when they heard he escaped from Elba, outlawed him completely. There will be no negotiation with him. Even if he beats the British, he can't win. On the 16th of June, as he enters Belgium, he will fight a couple of battles, one against a Prussian army at Ligny and a British army at Quatre Bras. He wins both, drives both those armies back, and then he picks one. He's going to go after the British. On the 18th of June, he will confront the British at Waterloo in Belgium, this rolling countryside, and this is his time to take on the Duke of Wellington. Napoleon, the great offensive-minded guy, Wellington, the great defensive-minded guy. Who's going to win? And it really is a knockdown, drag-out battle. The British have great defensive positions. The French are kind of lacking a little bit in their offensive. It's kind of a wet day, and the cannons aren't working very well, and the orders don't go well. It's still pretty much a smash-up battle there at Waterloo, and the British are saved by the Prussians. A Prussian army saves the day, arrives on Napoleon's flank, and defeats the French. And so even Wellington admitted, hey, the Prussians saved the day here. But nowadays, if you talk to the British, they won the Battle of Waterloo, and Wellington's the great hero, and he is a great commander. So let's give him his due. But the Battle of Waterloo, quite famous, especially for the British, when they fought the French, hand-to-hand, face-to-face. Really a smashing battle. Great movie. Watch the movie Waterloo. Great movie. Well, Napoleon, what do we do with him now? He's been defeated at Waterloo. He marches back to Paris, and he abdicates a second time. But there will be no negotiations with him this time. The British will actually claim him as their prisoner, put him on a boat, and send him down to St. Helena. He will be exiled the second time now to an island called St. Helena, not on the map. Nowhere near Italy, nowhere near France. In fact, where is St. Helena? It's about halfway between Brazil and Africa. If you pull out a map of the Atlantic Ocean, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean between Brazil and Africa is this little island. There are no ships passing by. There will be no French ships. Very few ships at all pass by that island. And this will be the way Napoleon goes. Poor Napoleon, the great military mind, exiled to the middle of nowhere by the British. Well, he does take a few. I don't want to finish the story up here a little bit, just kind of for fun. He takes a group of people with him to that island. Some of his loyal followers and his valets will go with him to this island. Everybody writes a book. We have lots and lots of books about what happened on the island. And he will die in 1821. So we had about 5 years of what he did on this little island. If you'd like to see a couple movies, some fun movies, they're actually kind of what-if movies. One is called The Emperor's New Clothes, where it's what if Napoleon escaped from St. Helena. And then there's another one called Monsieur N, the capital letter N, Monsieur N. It's a French-made movie. What if Napoleon escaped from the island? Really two fun movies to watch about Napoleon on the island of St. Helena, because everyone in the world is watching him on that island, and getting reports. What's he doing? Might he escape? Could he go back to France? And he eventually dies. And the British do the autopsy. Their captors do the autopsy, and they say cancer. They open up his stomach and say he's died of stomach cancer, like his father had died of stomach cancer. Lately, there's a theory going around started by a Swedish dentist who began to read all the documents of what was happening on the island, and the Swedish dentist will claim that it's all the signs of arsenic poisoning. And lately, some people have got a hold of pieces of Napoleon's hair. They did this back in the old days. They would send letters to people and include a lock of hair. And so a lot of people had locks of Napoleon's hair from St. Helena, and they began to test some of these hairs, and arsenic shows up. So the latest theory is arsenic poisoning. But I am having trouble with the arsenic theory, because the arsenic theory doesn't actually claim that that killed him, that weakened him so that a conspiracy of doctors could give him some lethal doses of strange medicines. It takes a lot. The arsenic thing I can believe. Maybe somebody was putting arsenic, but the final killing of Napoleon, it's a little tough to to manage that conspiracy theory. But it's a sad end to Napoleon on this island, the great conqueror of Europe, spending his last 5 years on this little tiny island, just dictating his memoirs. One thing he does do on the island is he kind of rewrites history a little bit. He's able to go back and talk about all these things that he did and kind of present his view. And if you're pro-Napoleon, that's the view that you want. If you're anti-Napoleon or British, of course, those are all just made up. You know, he's trying to change the history. Well, the British have the real history of the evil Napoleon. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. Well, anyway, let's go back and look at what's happening in Europe. The Congress system, they've been meeting at Vienna since 1814, and now they've come up with their agreements in 1815. And one of the things they agreed to is to continue to meet. Every year, these diplomats will meet to discuss the problems of Europe, to maintain the peace. And they'll actually do this for quite a while, about 40 years of actually keeping the peace in Europe, which is something pretty special because you look at the 1600s, 1700s, as we go into the 1800s, a lot of warfare. And they actually do a pretty good job of keeping the peace. On the negative side of this, they're extremely conservative. They want to put the genie of the French Revolution back in the bottle. And many of them are just talking about restoring feudalism, and that's not going to happen. There's no way you're going to be able to take these free peasants and say, that's it. You are now owned by someone. Again, you know, Napoleon's army has gone all over Europe, ending feudalism. And they'll try it in a few places, try to make the peasants serfs again. It's just not going to work. The other thing that all these leaders will do is talk about, you know, the fear of revolution, all these great things of the French Revolution spread all over Europe. There are occasional pop-ups of revolution, and they must be snuffed out. Any talk of revolution must be snuffed out. Any liberal reforms. Some of these kings actually were talking about granting constitutions with some liberal ideas, and other kings will have to move in and snuff those out. No liberal reforms. No talk of revolution. And yet Europe will be hit by a string of revolutions. 1820 was a big one in France, 1830, and then there's several all over Italy, the Italian states and the German states, culminating in the big ones all over Europe in 1848, which we talked about with Karl Marx. So then we've kind of come full circle now. Let's talk about the Congress system. Some other things they talk about in their meetings was a holy alliance, Christianity. That Christianity must be preserved. Again, the French Revolution had turned atheistic at one point, and they had declared Napoleon the Antichrist. So the Holy Alliance is formed of the Russians, the Prussians, the Austrians, and the French, not the British. The British will not have no part in this. You know, the British, they have their Church of England, and it's not completely tolerant, but it's more tolerant than that. And they will refuse to join any Holy Alliance that is dedicated to preserving Christianity in government. And all this will hold. The Congress system and the Holy Alliance will hold together until the Crimean War breaks out in 1853. So that is 40 years, pretty much, of Europe being held together by this Congress system or the Holy Alliance. The Holy Alliance breaks down when the Russians turn against the Turks in the Crimean War. They're going to try to, knock the Turks out, take Istanbul, and that's when Britain and France, enough is enough. The British and the French will step in to defend the Turks, who are not Christian, and that breaks that Holy Alliance. So the British and the French will turn with the Ottoman Empire against the Russians. The war is fought on the Crimean Peninsula and Ukraine, and they will actually defeat Russia. You know, we always talk about Russia never needs to surrender. You know, Russia's a gigantic country, they could surrender. They actually surrendered in 1856 to the British and the French, not because the British and the French occupied Russia, but just the country was in such bad shape economically that they just had to give in and surrender to the Allies, and that's the start of Russia beginning some changes, the freeing of the serfs and trying to present a different sort of government in Russia, heading toward a Russian Revolution eventually. So that's where we finish up. We've come full circle, starting in the buildup of 1870, toward World War I, and we've come all the way around to the ending of the Congress system, which allowed those nations to start going to war in the latter half of the 1800s. So thank you.